Sarah thought she had found her forever when she married Daniel. To the outside world, they were the picture of happiness, a perfect couple in a perfect home. But just weeks into their marriage, Sarah's secret betrayal set into motion a chain of events she never expected. When Daniel discovered the truth, he didn't shout, he didn't cry, and he didn't confront her. Instead, he chose a punishment far colder, far crueler: silence. The couple had been married only a short while. Yet everyone who saw them believed they had been destined for each other. Their wedding had been the talk of the community, filled with laughter, bright lights, and promises of a lifetime together. Friends whispered about how rare it was to find a pair so perfectly matched, while relatives praised their compatibility. They moved into a neat, quiet neighborhood, where the lawns were trimmed and the houses painted in cheerful colors, the kind of place where every door seemed to hide a happy family. To neighbors and acquaintances, their home instantly became a symbol of joy. He worked steadily, dependable and disciplined, while she seemed to bring life and warmth wherever she went. When they were seen together in public, their smiles felt like confirmation that love stories could truly last. Inside the house, the rhythm of married life had started to settle. Mornings began with small routines: coffee brewing, footsteps across the wooden floor, the familiar rustle of newspapers. Evenings ended with television humming softly in the background, or quiet conversations before bed. The husband believed in building a future brick by brick. He had always carried himself with a quiet seriousness, never careless with his words or actions. He worked hard, not just for himself but for her, eager to give his wife the kind of life he felt she deserved. In his mind, the marriage was a sacred promise, one that demanded trust and loyalty above all else. She, however, found herself restless. She smiled at her husband, accepted his care, and played the role expected of her, but beneath the surface she felt a pull she could not quite ignore. When she walked through the streets, she often caught herself remembering her past, the thrill of moments that were wild and uncertain, the kind of passion that her carefully ordered life no longer provided. These thoughts came like shadows, uninvited but persistent, especially during quiet evenings when the silence inside their home felt heavier than comfort should ever feel. She did not speak of it, not to her husband and not even to herself in clear words, but the temptation grew steadily in her heart. To the world, however, they were still perfect. They hosted neighbors for tea, smiled for photographs at family gatherings, and posted cheerful updates on social media. Each image of their happiness only added to the illusion that their marriage was strong and unshakable. No one could have guessed that behind the tidy curtains of their home, a storm was slowly forming. The cracks were invisible to others, and even the husband did not yet realize how fragile his marriage truly was. But for the wife, the seeds of betrayal had already been planted, and soon they would take root in ways no one could imagine. It began with a simple notification, one that seemed harmless at first. The wife glanced at her phone and saw a familiar name she had not expected to appear again. Her ex had reached out, his words casual and easy, as though no time had passed. She felt a rush in her chest, a mixture of surprise and something dangerously close to excitement. Curiosity pulled her in before she could think about consequences. She told herself it was nothing, just a conversation, just catching up. But the truth was, the message unlocked memories she had carefully buried since her wedding. What made it worse was how natural it all felt to her. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, only the dangerous comfort of something familiar. The ex reminded her of the thrill she once had, the passion that came with unpredictability. He was not stable or cautious like her husband. He was reckless, daring, and unafraid to break rules. That wildness tempted her, and soon her mind was consumed with thoughts she could not control. She tried to tell herself she was just reminiscing, just looking back for a moment, but her actions betrayed her. She started deleting messages, hiding her phone, and crafting small lies to explain where she had been. The first time they met in person again, she told herself it would be the only time. She dressed carefully, her nerves tangled with anticipation, but she masked it all under the excuse of running errands. When she saw him waiting, it felt as though no time had passed. The conversation flowed easily, the laughter came quickly, and before long she forgot about her vows, her home and her husband. The meeting turned into another, and then another. With each secret encounter, she sank deeper into the web she was weaving, all while telling herself she still had everything under control. Back at home, she returned to her husband with practiced ease. She played her role perfectly, smiling at him, asking about his day, preparing meals as if nothing had changed, but her heart no longer belonged entirely to the life she had built. Each lie she told, each glance at her phone, each rushed heartbeat when sneaking back into the house chipped away at the foundation of her marriage. She believed she was safe because her husband remained calm and unsuspecting. Yet in the quiet of the night when she lay beside him pretending to sleep, guilt crept in like a whisper. She ignored it, convincing herself the secret was hers alone to bear, not knowing that even the smallest lies can grow into the kind of truth that destroys everything. That evening she returned home later than usual, her heart still racing from the forbidden thrill of the meeting she had just left. She made sure to adjust her hair, fix her clothes, and wipe away the last traces of perfume that wasn't hers. She rehearsed in her mind the excuses she might use if questioned, though she convinced herself none would be needed. By the time she stepped through the front door, her face carried a practiced smile, one she had perfected to hide the chaos swirling within. She expected the house to be silent or her husband to be distracted, perhaps reading or preparing for bed. Instead, she found him sitting in the living room still and composed, as though he had been waiting for her. The sight of him caught her off guard, but she pushed down her unease. She kept smiling, moving through the house with false confidence, pretending everything was as it should be. Yet his silence unnerved her. He didn't greet her, didn't ask where she had been, didn't make any small remark. His eyes followed her movements without expression, and that lack of response unsettled her far more than any anger could have. She tried to fill the space with cheerful words, to make light conversation, but his stillness absorbed every attempt. It was as though she were speaking into a void, and the silence weighed heavily on her chest. That night, she could not rest. She lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, unsure if he was truly asleep or simply choosing not to engage. Every small sound in the house seemed amplified, every creak in the walls reminding her that something had shifted. She told herself he was only tired, that she was imagining things, but the way he carried himself made her doubt. She wondered if he knew, if her secrets had somehow slipped into the open. Still, she clung to the hope that his quietness was nothing more than a passing mood. In the days that followed, the pattern continued. She came home smiling, trying to maintain the facade, but he offered her nothing in return. His silence was deliberate, calculated, almost strategic. At meals he spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and plain. When she laughed, he gave no reaction. When she tried to draw him into conversation, he allowed the silence to stretch between them until she felt suffocated. The absence of confrontation was unbearable. She would have preferred shouting, accusations, anything that might have released the tension pressing down on her. Instead, he left her to drown in uncertainty. She began to study him in quiet moments, searching for signs that he knew the truth. His face gave nothing away, his actions steady and unchanged. It was impossible to tell what he thought, what he planned, or if he was simply letting her spiral in her own guilt. What frightened her most was that he did not look broken, nor did he seem desperate. He looked controlled, almost powerful, as though his silence was not weakness but punishment. She realized with growing dread that the more she smiled to hide her betrayal, the more his silence exposed it. Each day the unspoken truth grew heavier, and she understood that her secret was no longer hers alone. The silence grew heavier with each passing day, seeping into the walls of the house, until it felt like another presence living among them. She tried to pretend nothing was wrong, forcing herself to keep up with daily routines, but his quietness was impossible to ignore. It was not the silence of a man distracted or preoccupied. It was deliberate, sharp, and suffocating. Every time she spoke, His lack of response lingered in the air longer than words ever could. She could not escape it. At the breakfast table, she stirred her coffee louder than necessary just to break the unbearable stillness. At night she turned on the television, letting its noise fill the room, but even then, his silence overshadowed everything. She began to wonder if he truly knew. Had he seen something? Had she left a trace behind that gave her away? She replayed her steps over and over in her mind, searching for mistakes. The memory of messages hidden quickly, of receipts shoved into the bottom of her bag, of unexplained absences, all weighed on her. She had been careful, but what if careful had not been enough? His silence was an answer she could not decipher. It was worse than anger, worse than accusations, because it left her drowning in doubt. At times, she almost wished he would explode, shout, demand the truth. At least then she could measure his rage, argue, deny, or even beg for forgiveness. But with no words from him, she was left with her own thoughts, and her thoughts were crueler than any punishment he could give. She found herself glancing at him constantly, trying to read the smallest detail in his expression. Did the way he set down his glass mean something? Did the pause before he looked at her reveal that he knew? Every gesture became a riddle, and every unanswered question grew into a threat. The silence began to change her behavior. She became more cautious, more careful with her phone, more deliberate in her excuses. She stayed home more often, not out of guilt alone but out of fear that he was watching, waiting, silently judging. The life she had thought was under her control was now slipping through her fingers. She realized that she was no longer protecting her secret. She was fighting against the crushing weight of his stillness, and in that battle, she was already losing. When they went out together in public, his composure did not falter. To friends and neighbors, they looked the same as always, smiling, polite, perfectly matched. She noticed how convincing he appeared, how seamlessly he carried their image of happiness. Yet she knew that behind the performance, his silence was never broken. He was crafting something she could not yet see, and the thought unsettled her more than she could bear. At night, when the house was dark and she lay awake, the silence followed her into her dreams. It became a shadow she could not escape, a punishment she had not expected. She understood now that silence could wound deeper than words. Every day it chipped away at her certainty, leaving her desperate, anxious, and paranoid. And still, he said nothing. That silence became her prison, and she was trapped inside with only her guilt for company. He had known far longer than she imagined. The truth had not come to him in one dramatic moment, but rather through fragments, small details she overlooked. It began with a slip of her hand one evening when she left her phone unattended on the sofa. A message preview glowed on the screen, the kind that lingered just long enough to raise questions. He didn't pick it up, didn't accuse her, didn't even move. He only stored the image in his mind. Days later, when he went to put away laundry, he found a crumpled receipt shoved into the pocket of her purse, from a place he knew they had never visited together. Again he said nothing. He allowed the pieces to gather, each one slotting neatly into the puzzle of betrayal he was building in silence. He studied her carefully, more carefully than she realized. The way she glanced at her phone and quickly turned it over. The way her excuses for late evenings grew vaguer. The way her smile returned a little too wide, as though she carried joy from someplace else. To her, they were small things, easy to dismiss. To him, they were confessions without words. He never confronted her, not because he lacked the strength, but because he was patient. He wanted the truth to reveal itself fully, and he wanted time to decide what punishment would be worse than anger. In secret, he began to collect evidence. Not in the dramatic way of following her or hiring someone, but through the ordinary trails she carelessly left behind. Bank statements showed small transactions at odd hours. An unfamiliar name flashed briefly in the corner of her call history. Emails buried deep in her inbox carried more weight than she realized. He didn't need everything, only enough to confirm what he already knew. And once he had gathered enough, he stopped looking. The truth was no longer hidden, it was alive in his hands. What surprised him most was not the betrayal itself, but the calm it brought him. Instead of feeling shattered, he felt resolved. There was no need for shouting or desperate questions. He would not give her the power of his outrage. He would take control in silence, dismantling her world piece by piece, until she understood the cost of her choices. The quiet he wrapped around her was not born of weakness, but of strategy. Every moment he withheld his words, she unraveled a little more. Still, he lived as though nothing had changed. He went to work, greeted neighbors, and sat at the dinner table across from her, watching her struggle under the weight of her own guilt. She believed she was hiding her secret, but in truth, she was already exposed. His silence was the mask behind which he planned his next move. He knew that one day soon she would discover just how much he had seen, how much he had gathered, and how thoroughly he had prepared. Until then, he let her twist in the uncertainty, never realizing that her downfall had already been set in motion. Outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. To neighbors, friends, and family, they were still the smiling couple who had promised the world to each other only months before. They arrived together at gatherings, their arms brushing casually as if affection had never waned. Photographs captured them in perfect frames. His calm, steady expression, her polished smile. No one would have guessed that beneath those carefully crafted moments, silence was eroding everything inside their home. The illusion of happiness had become their greatest weapon, but it served two different purposes. For her, it was protection from suspicion, and for him, it was the stage on which he played out his calculated restraint. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere was starkly different. She felt it most at the dinner table, where clinking cutlery became louder than words and the ticking of the clock filled the air like a warning. She tried to create conversation, bringing up trivial details from her day, but his responses remained clipped, polite but detached. The longer his silence stretched, the more she questioned herself. Did he know everything? Was he waiting for her to confess? Or was this simply his way of retreating into himself? Every possibility gnawed at her, but no answer came. She began to feel trapped in her own performance. When they visited friends, she laughed louder than before, hoping to mask the growing hollowness. She leaned into him in photos, clutching his arm a little too tightly, as if her grip could convince the world and herself that they were still bound by love. But each time she looked at him, she noticed his composure, his unreadable calm. He never slipped, never betrayed even a flicker of what he truly felt. It was maddening, because the absence of reaction felt louder than any confrontation could have. Her restlessness deepened. She grew more attentive at home, cooking his favorite meals, asking about his work, even leaving small notes of affection she thought might soften the silence. None of it broke through. He accepted everything with the same steady indifference, neither rejecting her gestures nor embracing them. His stillness made her own efforts feel desperate, as though she were clinging to something that was already gone. The house, once filled with the hum of ordinary life, now felt like a stage where she performed tirelessly for an audience that refused to applaud. Meanwhile, he carried on as though nothing weighed on him. He woke at the same hour, left for work with the same quiet discipline, and greeted neighbors with the same civility. Yet his silence inside the home was not accidental. It was part of his design. He had no intention of arguing or fighting. His punishment was subtler, crueler. He wanted her to live with the unbearable knowledge that something was wrong, but to never know exactly how much he understood. The calm before the storm stretched on, each day feeding her anxiety. She was trapped in uncertainty, unsure when or if the silence would finally break. What she did not realize was that he had already decided how it would end. He was waiting, not for her confession, but for the moment when his quiet dismantling of their life together would leave her with nothing left to hold on to. One evening, she returned home, expecting the same quiet routine. The heavy silence, the distant looks, the suffocating stillness. But as she stepped inside, something was wrong. The air felt different, lighter in a way that unsettled her. She walked through the hallway, noticing immediately that the familiar details of their life together had vanished. The framed photographs of their wedding were gone from the walls. The neatly folded blanket on the couch was missing. Even the faint scent of his cologne, usually lingering in the living room, had disappeared. Panic pricked at her skin as she moved from room to room, realizing the house was disturbingly empty. His belongings were nowhere to be found. She rushed to the bedroom, hoping she was mistaken, but the sight there confirmed her worst fears. His side of the closet was bare, hangers swinging slightly as though they had just been stripped of his shirts. The drawers where he kept his ties and watch were pulled out, emptied of everything. The neat arrangement of his books on the nightstand was gone, replaced by nothing but dust and silence. For a moment she stood frozen, her smile, the mask she had carried for weeks, falling away completely. She called his name into the hollow house, but only silence answered back. Then she saw it, a plain envelope resting on the kitchen counter. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, sensing it contained more than just words. Inside she found photographs, images of her and her ex together, captured from angles she hadn't noticed. Each one was undeniable, proof of every lie she had told. Her breath caught as she flipped through them, her pulse quickening with dread. Along with the photographs lay a stack of papers. She didn't need to read the first line to know what they were. Divorce document. His signature already marked the pages, bold and final, leaving no space for negotiation. The weight of his silence became clear. He had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to confront her. Every moment of his withdrawal had been leading to this, a plan executed with precision. He had dismantled their marriage, not through anger, but through calm preparation. By the time she realized it, everything was gone, his presence, his love, the life they had built together. The photographs made it impossible to deny what she had done, and the signed papers made it clear she had no power to undo it. Her legs gave way as she sank into a chair, staring at the evidence of her betrayal spread across the table. For weeks she had feared the moment he might explode, imagined fights and screaming matches. But this quiet abandonment was far worse. It was clean, final, and merciless. She tried to imagine where he was, if he would ever return, if she could ever explain, but she knew it was too late. His silence had not been hesitation. It had been the slow drawing of a curtain, leaving her alone on a stage with no audience and no escape. She sat alone in the hollow shell of the house, the echo of silence pressing down heavier than ever before. Envelopes still lay on the table, its contents spread like shards of glass, each photograph cutting into her with a pain she couldn't dull. She touched the papers again and again, hoping to find some flaw, some opening that would allow her to fight, but there was none. His signature was bold, confident, absolute. It was the mark of a man who had made his decision long before she realized she was already condemned. The silence he had carried for weeks suddenly revealed its true meaning. It had never been hesitation. It had been punishment, carefully delivered, leaving her to suffer without a single word spoken. She tried to remember the exact moment everything began to unravel, searching for a turning point where she could have chosen Chisney. Was it the first reply to her ex's message? The first meeting she allowed herself to justify as harmless, or the night she walked in smiling, so certain she had hidden her betrayal? Each memory now replayed with cruel clarity. The smile she once wore so carelessly had become the image that haunted her most. She thought she was clever, but his silence had stripped her bare, leaving nothing but shame behind. Days turned into a blur of emptiness. She wandered the rooms, noticing how quiet they felt without him. The smallest details tortured her, the empty space on the shelf where his books once stood, the missing dent in the pillow where his head used to rest, the absence of his shoes by the door. These ordinary absences became wounds, reminders that she was no longer part of the life she thought she controlled. The silence was no longer just his, it was hers now, a void she could not escape. She reached out to him, tried to call, sent messages that were never answered. Her words hung unanswered in the digital space, her pleas swallowed in the same silence that had suffocated her for weeks. He had not left in anger, he had left with finality, cutting her off completely, as if she had ceased to exist. That realization broke her in ways she could not have anticipated. She had feared confrontation, feared arguments, feared exposure, but nothing compared to the weight of being erased from his life so completely. The world outside went on as though nothing had happened. Neighbors still waved politely, friends still posted pictures of their own happy moments, families still gathered on weekends. She smiled for them too, just as she always had. But the smile no longer fooled even herself. Behind closed doors she was haunted by silence. His silence, her silence, the silence of everything she had destroyed. She came to understand too late that the absence of words could wound more deeply than any fight. She would have pervert anger, even hatred, over this quiet abandonment. Instead, she was left with nothing but the echo of her own choices, trapped in a prison built not by locks or walls, but by the quiet indifference of the man she had betrayed. His silence had been her punishment, and it was one she would carry for the rest of her life.